Starting off at number 10 now, we have the miracle on the Hudson. On January 15th, 2009, US Airways Flight 1549 took off from New York's LaGuardia Airport. 3 minutes later, it struck a flock of Canada geese and lost all engine power. The pilot quickly calculated that returning to the airport was no longer an option. They needed to land right now. He made the decision to land on the Hudson River. Now this was an extremely risky move. If they came in at slightly the wrong angle or speed, the whole plane could break apart. To make things even worse, it was the middle of January and temperatures were below freezing on the river. Against the odds, the pilot successfully glided the plane down. All 155 people aboard were rescued by nearby boats and there were very few serious injuries. The flight crew were showered with awards and praise. The event was even made into a movie starring Tom Hanks as pilot Chelsea B. Sullenberger. Alright, coming in at number 9 now, we have the missile attack. On November 22nd, 2003, a DHL Airbus cargo plane took off from Iraq's capital of Baghdad. Shortly after, it was struck on the tip of its left wing by a missile fired by on the ground. It penetrated the fuel tank, which burned away most of the wing. The pilots desperately tried to stabilize the plane, but it had already lost control and they had to attempt a landing back at the airport. The aircraft was crippled, on fire and approaching the runway far too fast. To make things even worse, a jolt of turbulence caused them to miss the middle of the runway and veer off into the sand when they landed. It took them over 3,000 feet, but eventually they came to a complete stop. The 3 people on board survived with no injuries and the pilots were presented with honorary awards. At the number 8 spot now, we have the door. On June 12, 1972, American Airlines Flight 96 was on its way from Detroit to Buffalo when its rear cargo door just blew off. This happened almost 12,000 feet in the air and so there was rapid decompression. This damaged the plane's hydraulic controls. The crew declared an emergency and turned back towards Detroit. The windows began to steam up on the plane as the decompression crept up to the passenger cabin. The oxygen masks failed to deploy, so the stewards had to go around with an oxygen bottle. Despite all of this, they safely landed in Detroit after a very rough landing. The only victim of the event was actually a dead person. Their coffin was being transported in the cargo hold and fell to the ground during the flight. Next up at number 7, we have the volcano. On June 24, 1982, British Airways Flight 9 was flying from the UK to New Zealand. When they were above the Indian Ocean, the crew started to notice something clogging up the windscreen. They switched the plane to de-ice mode and told the passengers to buckle up even though their radar showed clear skies ahead. When the cabin started to fill with smoke, they knew something was seriously wrong. They had been flying through a cloud of volcanic ash from a nearby volcano that had not shown on the radar. Soon after, all 4 engines completely cut out. The plane began gliding down and calling for help to nearby airports. Some passengers feared for their lives and they wrote notes for their loved ones. Amazingly, they managed to land safely in Jakarta using only their onboard instruments as the ash cloud had made it impossible to see outside. All 263 people on board survived. Next up at number 6 now, we have United Airlines Flight 232. This plane was flying from Denver to Chicago on July 19, 1989 when one of the engines completely failed due to a crack on the fan disc, leading to the loss of all flight controls. The crew were now forced to use the 2 remaining engines and slowly bring the plane down to a lower altitude and hopefully towards a runway. They were low, which was good, but going far too fast. They slammed down onto the runway and the aircraft instantly broke apart. It then rolled over and caught fire. Tragically, 111 people in this event. However, 185 people did survive, thanks in part to the skill of the pilots and the speed of the emergency services. If there is any silver line to this story, it's that it taught aircraft designers important lessons on how to avoid this problem ever happening again. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the Gimli glider. On July 23rd, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143 ran out of fuel at 41,000 feet in the air on its way from Montreal to Edmonton. The ground crew had fueled the plane using pounds instead of kilograms. This meant they actually had less than half the amount of intended fuel in their tank. When the first engine went out, they prepared for an emergency landing. As they descended towards Winnipeg, the second engine went out at 35,000 feet. Their electronic flight instrument went dead. Everything went black except for a few basic battery-powered flight instruments. To make matters even worse, the pilots had never been trained to land with both engines out, and their flight manual didn't even tell them either. They diverted diverted to what they thought was a small disused airport, but on that day there was actually a car show going on. The plane came in too fast and smashed its nose into the runway. This managed to slow it down enough to avoid the crowds, which was a good thing because many of them actually had no idea the plane was even approaching due to the fact that its engines were dead, so it was completely silent. Alright, next up at number 4 now, we have Pan Am Flight 6. On October 16, 1956, Pan Am Flight 6 was on its way from Honolulu, Hawaii to San Francisco. After climbing to 21,000 feet, one of their engines began to overspeed. The pilot slowed the plane down and cut the oil to that engine in order to try and stop it. This worked, but the propeller still kept spinning. They knew they were in trouble. They calculated that the drag from the propeller would cause so much excess fuel consumption that they would not have enough fuel to reach San Francisco. They had to land in the ocean. The pilot waited until daytime to get the best visibility and then started the landing descent. Just before landing, the wing clipped a wave and spun out of control. The whole tail end of the plane broke off, but the pilot had already ordered it to be evacuated, so all 31 passengers survived and were rescued by the Coast Guard. Next up at number 3 now, we have the Navajo Save. In June 1993, air taxi pilot Edward Wire was flying a small Piper Navajo plane across England with 7 passengers on board. About 40 miles from their destination, there was a huge bang and both engines went quiet. The right engine had fallen off. The exposed blade then ripped through the other engine. The plane started spinning wildly, and although Wyatt managed to recover it, it would happen again unless he maintained a steep descent that would make for a very dangerous landing. Below him, he spotted an open field and went for it. He dodged power lines while operating the controls meant for 2 people because the co-pilot seat was being occupied by a passenger. There was no co-pilot. Amazingly, the plane glided down into the field gently, and the only injury was a single person with whiplash. Next up at number 2 now, we have China Airlines Flight 006. This was a non-stop flight on its way from Taipei to LA on February 19, 1985. 10 hours into the flight, one of the engines failed, an engine that had given them problems before, but they thought had been fixed. The plane started to slow down and spin to the right as it dropped. Because of the clouds, the pilots became spatially disorientated and they had no idea which way up they were. They spiraled for 30,000 feet downwards, and when they broke through the clouds, the pilot finally leveled out the plane. Those on board had experienced almost 5 Gs of force. They continued on with their journey and landed safely in San Francisco. Thankfully, none of the crew or the 251 passengers were injured. And finally now, at number 1, we have Aloha. On April 28, 1988, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 was flying between Hilo and Honolulu in Hawaii. When the plane reached 24,000 feet, a small section of the left side of the roof was ruptured. There was a loud whooshing noise. The pilot felt the aircraft start to roll from side to side. When they got it under control, they looked back to see the entire cockpit door was just gone. They saw blue sky where the first class ceiling had been just moments before. The explosion had ripped the entire roof off. All of the passengers were buckled into their seats, but one flight attendant was thrown out of the plane because she was standing up. The pilot managed to safely divert and land the plane soon after, with half of the roof simply missing. I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been for the passengers, but good job to the pilots.
Starting off this list, in at number 10, we have the Ethiopian Flight 961. This flight was en route to Kenya from Ethiopia when it was hijacked by 3 Ethiopians who were seeking asylum in Australia. They forced the pilot to fly the plane to Australia, despite the pilot telling them that they didn't have enough fuel. The men threatened to the plane if the pilots didn't obey their demand. Very scary situation. The plane was nearly out of fuel as it approached a large island with lots of tourists. The pilot tried to make an emergency landing at the island's airport, but he lost control because he got into a fight with the hijackers. The plane crashed into the Indian Ocean, and 125 out of 175 passengers died that day. An underwear explodes onto this list at number 9. Northwest Airlines Flight 253 was scheduled to fly from Amsterdam to Detroit on December 25th, 2009, so yeah, Christmas Day. But one passenger had something else in mind. He tried to set off chemical that were sewn into his underwear. There were 290 people on board the aircraft, so if his was successful, this would have been one of the deadliest aviation occurrences on US soil. The 23-year-old and before he was able to detonate his another passenger saw smoke and quickly tackled him to the ground, and he was able to put out the fire. The was handcuffed and the pilot was able to safely land the plane. Alright, up next, number 8, we have US Airways Flight 1549, or otherwise known as Miracle on the Hudson. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. The commercial airplane had to make an emergency landing in the Hudson River on January 15th, 2009, shortly after it took off from LaGuardia Airport in New York City. Miraculously, there was only 5 people who were seriously injured and no fatalities. So about 2 minutes into the flight, the airplane flew into a flock of Canadian geese, which caused both engines to become severely damaged. The pilot tried to restart the engines, but they failed to start. He told air traffic control that he was returning to the airport, but the plane continued to fall, so he knew that he wouldn't be able to make it back. So shortly after, he said that he was going to try to attempt a very risky and rare water landing right in the Hudson River. Thankfully, he successfully landed the plane, and he made sure that all of his passengers and crew members made it out of the plane alive. He even went up and down the aisles a few times as the plane was quickly sinking to make sure that he got everyone out. He is such a true legend, and hence the reason why Hollywood made a movie about this. Some terrifying turbulence shakes things up in at number 7. That video was recorded during an Etihad Airways flight that showed terrified passengers praying for their lives after this plane encountered severe and unexpected turbulence. Passengers were clenching onto their seats and yelling Allahu Akbar. Some other passengers were thrown from their seats and they actually hit the roof and floor of the cabin. One of the flight attendants said that she has been a flight attendant for 15 years, and this is actually the first time that she's ever experienced something like that. The washing machine flight takes us into number 6. Passengers on board of Air Asia flight were told by the captain to say a prayer after there was a problem with the engine. Is this real life right now? If I heard the captain of the plane saying, "Alright guys, it's time to pray," I would be freaking out. I would be losing my shit. Like, what the hell is going on? Is this the last moments of my life? So after about an hour into the flight, passengers heard a loud bang and the engine aircraft began to violently shake. Why the hell are passengers moving around the cabin? Do they think that this is normal? I would be buckled up like, oh my god, what the hell is going on? The flight was eventually rerouted back to Perth due to technical issues, and the aircraft finally landed about 3 hours after departure. So pretty much these passengers on the plane were shaking for hours. Once they landed, the passengers were told that one of the blades had actually come off the turbine. If I'm on a plane, I don't want to hear about anything coming off of a plane, unless I'm on the ground and it's me getting off the plane. I'm pretty sure my flying days would be over. I'd be taking a boat to my next destination, even if it took me a month to reach it. Fuel gushing out of a plane lands itself at number 5. Yeah, this one does not sound good at all. Imagine if you're sitting on a plane and the flight attendant finishes their safety demonstration and everyone was sitting down, buckled up. Now imagine that you're just waiting for clearance to take off, but you look outside your window and you notice this. Take a look at this. Yeah, I'd say your flight is going to be slightly delayed. I might want to check onto another flight. It's actually crazy because a passenger brought it up to a flight attendant and no one even noticed it. If this guy didn't tell these people about this leak, they would have tried to take off. This was a United Airlines flight, so it doesn't really surprise me. A gaping hole brings us to number 4. A China Eastern Airlines flight was forced to turn back to Sydney after there was a severe technical failure that left a gaping hole in the engine casing. Yeah, I'd say that that's a pretty good enough reason for me to turn back. Passengers on board of this flight said that they could smell something burning in the cabin, and there was a loud sound of banging at the start of the flight. Well, that's not too comforting at all.
One passenger said, quote, "I was scared, really scared. Our whole group was terrified." A China Eastern official said on Monday, quote, "The crew observed the abnormal situation of the left engine and decided to return to Sydney Airport immediately."
The pilot was able to land the plane safely, and thankfully everyone on board managed to make it out alive. A propeller that fell off lands itself in at number 3. A plane was forced to make an emergency landing after one of its propellers fell off while it was flying over Sydney. There were 16 passengers and 3 crew members on board of this aircraft, and I bet all of them were scared. The propeller reportedly detached from the shaft and flew over the wing without touching it. They were all extremely lucky that this flying propeller didn't hit the tail or the fuselage, because they probably would have all been dead. British Airlines Flight 9 flies onto this list at number 2. Back in June of 1982, this jumbo jet had 248 passengers on board, and they were flying over Indonesia where all 4 engines suddenly stopped working. That's literally one of my worst nightmares coming true. As the crews worked hard to restart the engines, the captain went on the speaker to say this: "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped, and we're doing our damnedest to get it under control. I trust you are not in too much distress." I mean, is this freaking real life right now? I would have had an instant heart attack and died on the spot. How can you calmly tell your passengers that all of the engines have failed, but you're trying your best to restart them? I'd rather you didn't say it at all, or at least wait until the problem was fixed and then explain the problem. Like about 5 minutes ago, the engines, yeah, they were messed up. They're good now. They're good now. And thankfully, they were able to restart some of the engines and make an emergency landing. TWA Flight 847 tops our list at number 1. This flight was scheduled to fly from Athens to Rome, but it was hijacked by terrorists. The flight was taken over by 2 Arabic-speaking Lebanese men who managed to smuggle a gun and 2 grenades through the Athens airport security. Over the course of 17 horrific days, the pilot was forced to make repeated trips back and forth from Beirut to Algiers with all of his 153 passengers and crew members on board. The terrorists have tied passengers up and they were severely beating them. The hijackers threatened to kill them unless hundreds of Lebanese prisoners were released from an Israeli prison. 1 man was murdered and the rest of the hostages were released 2 weeks later until some of their demands were met.
So starting us off at number 10, we have sitting next to a creepy or gross passenger. If you're traveling alone, this can be especially concerning. Being on a plane often involves sitting next to a stranger for hours on end, so if they're creepy or gross or just plain weird, the whole journey can be a little bit scary. Imagine waking up after a nap on the plane to find the guy or girl next to you just like staring at you. I also hate when they accidentally or purposefully touch you, like this is my armrest and we are not sharing. Also, flying is a time when you need to trust the people around you, so if someone's weird or a bit sketchy, you don't want to leave your stuff by them, just in case when you get up and go to the washroom, they steal things.
Number 9, let's talk about turbulence. Now this can be a very scary situation because turbulence is when there's a change in pressure. This causes the plane to like bounce around. I mean, this is so crazy because you're thousands of feet in the air. Sometimes the plane loses altitude and drops several feet very quickly and you get like that roller coaster feeling in your stomach. You're like, oh my god, I'm about to die. Your stomach gets all knotted up, your life is just flashing before you, but you realize that yeah, this is pretty normal, everything is pretty safe. Well, the chance of a plane going down during turbulence is very rare. Planes are actually designed for turbulence. The only scary part is not knowing when you're going to be served food next, because during this time, all service stops. You never know how long the turbulence is going to last for, and if you got to go to the bathroom really badly, well, yeah, you're in a really rough situation going on. And also, you're in turbulence, the plane is shaking, and you're trying to hold in your pee. I mean, there's nothing scarier than that.
I hate turbulence. It really scares me, so look. So moving on to number 8, we have seeing someone acting suspiciously. Now this is quite different to someone being a creep. This is more, you see someone on the plane looking shifty and behaving in a weird way. This will freak you out and you'll spend the whole flight worrying. For example, I was recently on a flight where the guy in front of me was praying the whole way through, touching his heart and doing the crucifix symbol. And I was like thinking, do you know something that I don't? Are we going down here? Should I start praying? Like, dude, seriously.
Now at number 7, we have, things are about to get serious because we have a bomb on the plane. This one is everyone's worst nightmare. A bomb on a plane isn't something new. This has actually happened many times and it's sad to say that. We hear about these things all the time, about airplanes having bombs on board. Take a look at this picture right here. This is a passenger plane that had a huge hole on the side of the plane. This was believed to be from a suicide bomber. There was many unanswered questions to this event, but apparently the bomb went off and created a big hole in the plane, and the suicide suicide bomber was the only passenger to get like sucked out right out of the plane. So talk about karma. Luckily the pilot was able to make an emergency landing and everyone on board was okay.
How is that a number 7 landing? That's like my biggest plane fear. Slightly less dramatic at number 6, we have food poisoning from airplane food. Back in 2012, needles were found in a Delta Airline turkey sandwich, which is pretty intense. Needles, like, really? There have also been countless reports of airplane food poisoning throughout the history of commercial aviation. What I'm getting at here is that any food is at risk of contamination. Even though it's unlikely, mistakes can be made with sanitation. Can you imagine being the person who was stabbed by the needle that they bit into while they were flying? This actually happened. If any contamination happened, eating something dodgy on a plane would be an absolute nightmare, especially if the food poisoning kicked in while you were mid-flight and you needed to use the toilet frequently. That just wouldn't be ideal.
Okay, maybe bombs on a plane should have been a lot like closer to number 1 on this list. But now at number 5, let's talk about flying in harsh weather conditions. Now this can be very scary, and I remember one time me and my fiance were flying through a thunderstorm and I'm thinking like, is this real life right now? Are we supposed to be doing this right now? And I couldn't help to think like what would happen if we were struck. So I actually researched it and nothing happens. Like if you get struck, the plane still flies and you get to your destination. It would have to be a really like a freak accident for the plane to actually go down. Planes are designed to withstand lightning, so nothing would happen. But still, if I'm flying in lightning, I'm still gonna get freaked out because like you're seeing the flashing, it's so bright, you're right there, and the thunder is so loud.
Oh my god, I actually was on a plane that was struck by lightning twice as I was flying from Thailand to England, and on the descent it was struck and it was so dramatic, like the noise it made. Whew, but like you said, planes are built to withstand that, so I was fine. So coming into number 4, we have oxygen masks dropping. I would absolutely freak out if my oxygen mask dropped in the middle of the flight. Like, it does happen, but it would be so scary. This happens when there is a change in cabin pressure and you're in danger of passing out if you do not get extra oxygen. What is also scary is that the chemicals used to generate the oxygen release a burning smell when the masks drop, and even though it's safe to breathe, that would be very alarming. What is also scary is that there's only 15 minutes of oxygen in the tank, meaning that the pilots would need to get down to a safe altitude pretty quickly. If not, you could die.
I'm still questioning my own list here because bombs are at number 7. I'm thinking I put it there, I scripted it because it's not as common as these other things, but right now we're at number 3, and I know this also doesn't happen often, but I've been hearing some stories about it. But some places in the world I'm super afraid to fly to, like this is like legit, because I have a small fear of being shot down by terrorists. Is it just only me, or is this a common thing? In the Middle East, they have been known to shoot down some planes, and some planes were passenger planes. So flying over the Middle East is very scary, but I do have a story that took place over Ukraine and around Russia. One of the most recent big cases of this was back in 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, if you guys remember that. That was actually shot down by a Russian-made air missiles near Ukraine. All 283 passengers and 15 crew members were killed on board. There were also 80 children on the plane. So it just seems like these days you never know what can happen. So there's a lot of places that I just don't choose to visit, like Syria or you know those places down there. Even if it's just like a flyby of the Middle East, I'm not even going to the Middle East. It's still very scary.
So you've talked about bombs and terrorists gunning down a plane, but you haven't talked about potential terrorists on the flight, which is a whole different issue coming in at number 2. We are of course talking about hijacking. Imagine being on an aircraft that a terrorist is planning on holding up. Even if they aren't successful, which they probably won't be, the whole situation would be absolutely terrifying. Air safety and security is very high these days, but it does still happen. Most recently in the German Wings case of Andreas Lubitz, who was a co-pilot that hijacked and crashed a plane, which I guess leads us to Landon's final point, which I don't even want to hear because I'm very scared.
And finally, we've made it to number 1, and I think this is the scariest thing that could happen while you're on a plane, and that's crashing. A lot of times plane crashes usually are deadly, but there are people who have survived plane crashes and live to tell their story of what happened. Back in 1987, there was a plane crash that had one survivor on it. She was known as the sole survivor, and she was just 4 years old. She was a little baby at this time. After 26 years, Cecilia Crocker talked about this experience. Listen.
I think about the accident every day. When I look in the mirror, I have visual scars, my arms and my legs, and have a scar on my forehead.
I mean, that's really crazy when you think about it, but you guys should watch the documentary. I'll make sure to put the links in the description down below.
So I think maybe you put a bomb at number 7 just to like surprise, like a bomb would be. Like, you know, no one expected it to be at number 7, but surprise, bombs. But guys, ultimately,
We have this. As this audio continued, the pilot's last word was, "It's over." The last words will haunt this man's family and friends forever. So that was recorded on the black box of Japan's Airlines Flight 123. It took place back in 1985 in Saudar-Degama Prefecture, which is located in Japan, which is northwest of Tokyo. This flight killed 520 people on board. This accident was one of the deadliest single plane crashes in their history. This flight was on the eve of the Japanese holiday Bon, which is a festival to honor the spirits of one's ancestors. So everyone on this plane was on holiday. Many people were going to go visit their family and friends and loved ones. The pilot noticed an altitude change and he was losing control of the plane. The plane fell 10,000 feet and he continued to send distress calls and asked to be rerouted to Tokyo Airport. But almost 1 hour into the flight, it crashed into Mount Takamaghara. It took 14 hours for rescue crews to locate the plane and try to save as many people as possible. 4 people were able to survive the plane crash. The pilot was not one of them. Number 9, there were many phone calls made during the 9/11 attacks. It was a very devastating day for America and the rest of the world when a terrorist attack unfolded. Well, just minutes before United Airlines Flight 175 slammed into the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, 38-year-old Brian Sweeney made his last phone call. The phone call was made to his wife from the back of the plane. Brian's wife didn't pick up the phone, which is just so heartbreaking to me, but on a voicemail he said, "I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. If things don't go well and it's not looking good, I just want you to know I absolutely love you. I want you to do good. Go have good times. Same to my parents and everyone. I just totally love you. And I'll see you when you get there. Bye, babe. I hope I can call you." I don't even know what to say about that. It's extremely a sad situation and a phone message you just never want to listen to. That phone call was placed just 3 minutes before the crash occurred. Moving into number 8, we have this also from the day of the horrific attack.
And there's somebody stabbed in business class, and we can't breathe in business class. Somebody's got mace or something.
Can you describe the person that you said someone is what in business class?
I'm sitting in the back. Somebody's coming back from business. If you can hold on for 1 second, they're coming back.
So that was from Betty Ann Ung. She was a flight attendant on the plane. She said someone was stabbed, she can't breathe, and thinks she is getting hijacked. Is it just me, or does she sound very, very calm about the whole thing? Betty was on flight 11, which was actually the first plane to become hijacked during the 9/11 attacks. Shortly after the hijacking, Betty notified the American Airlines ground crew, and she stayed on the phone for about 25 minutes. Because of this hijacking, it led to closing the airspace by FAA, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, for the first time in United States history. Number 7. So that was the last audio and video footage of the Brazilian football team that crashed. This took place on November 28, 2016. It was Alemia Flight 2933 that killed 71 of 77 people on board. The Brazilian football team was on their way to play in the 2016 Copa Sudamericana finals. The cause of this flight was unexcusable. It was due to fuel exhaustion, which means there was poor flight planning. And also there was a failure to declare an emergency after fuel levels became critically low. It seems like this accident could have been avoided. I'm sure that there was a massive class action lawsuit in place. Sadly, moving into number 6, we have a woman who texted her dad before her plane crashed. Enda, this girl right here, well, she's 30 years old, and she's actually a former Miss Indonesia finalist who sent her dad Peter one final text message just minutes before she and her husband were killed in a plane crash. The text message said, "Papa, how are you?" Also, Enda sent messages to several of her friends. Enda's father replied to his daughter's text message, but he realized that there was no answer, and then after he realized why, after he watched the news. I would be so heartbroken, I wouldn't know what to do. Enda's plane mysteriously crashed into Perth's Swan River. Investigators are looking into the cause of the accident. Now at number 5, we have this. Alright, good night. That was said by either the pilot or co-pilot on Malaysian Airlines flight 370. This flight actually disappeared, and it's not known if this was intentionally or not, because why would someone flying the plane just say alright, good night, and there doesn't seem to be any distress? All 227 passengers and 12 crew members aboard the plane are presumed dead. The disappearance of flight 370 was the deadliest incident involving a Boeing 777 plane, and the deadliest incident of Malaysian Airlines history. The search for this plane became the most costly of aviation history. Investigators really wanted to know what the heck happened during this flight, but it seems like this will for now remain one of the greatest aviation's mysteries. Number 4.
Mayday, mayday, speedbird, 9595.
That was the black box audio from British Airlines Flight 38. This Boeing 777 plane crashed back in 2008 at the London Heathrow Airport. The cause for the crash was fuel starvation caused by ice. Also, the ice caused a shorter runway to safely land the plane. Fortunately for this plane crash, there was no fatalities. There was 152 people on board and just 47 people sustained injuries. There was one serious injury. This plane was the first Boeing 777 to be written off in their history. In 2009, it was announced that 10 passengers were suing Boeing for the suffering that they had to go through. It was reported that each of the passengers, well, they could receive up to $1 million. The lawsuit alleged that the design of the aircraft was defective and unreasonably dangerous. All of the claims were settled out of court a few years later in 2012. Number 3. That was the last words recorded by the pilot and co-pilot of American Airlines Flight 191. This deadly crash happened on May 25th, 1979 that killed 273 people. The plane crashed due to loss of control that was caused by the engine coming off due to improper maintenance. This flight was going from Chicago, Illinois to Los Angeles International Airport. With 273 fatalities, it was the deadliest aviation accident to have occurred in the United States. There were no survivors. Number 2.
Morning, myself. Do you want to go to Tamiami and land? You have a door open? Is that what you're saying?
I have a door ajar and a passenger that fell down. I am 6 miles from Tamiami.
That was a mayday call from the pilot of Piper PA-46 aircraft. This plane was about 2,000 feet in the air when a passenger fell out of the plane. Coast Guard and Miami-Dade Fire Rescue and Water United searched for the missing person. The Miami-Dade Police Department sent homicide detectives to the airport to further investigate what happened. Police have not indicated any evidence of foul play, so it was most likely an accident. But I don't know about you guys, but I wouldn't be that calm if a passenger just fell out of my plane. Finally, at number 1, this one is insane. You are about to listen to an audio from a Horizon Air employee, Richard Russell, who decided to steal a plane and take it for a flight.
Ruin your day.
Just flying the plane around, you seem comfortable with that?
Oh, hell yeah, it's a blast, man. I played video games before, so I know what I'm doing a little bit.
Is this real life right now? This guy is absolutely insane. Apparently Richard Russell was described as a suicidal man, so he didn't care what he was doing. He decided he wanted to steal a plane and fly it wherever he wanted. Richard Russell did crash the plane, but just before the air traffic control was trying to help him, Air Traffic Control was trying to help him land the plane safely. Richard knew that what he did might result in some jail time, so he wasn't really interested in landing the plane.
I'm going to try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, then I'm just going to nose down and call it a night.
Well, Rich, before you do that, let's think about this. I got another pilot coming up, Pilot Joel, here in just a minute or two, I hope.